The sonar screen should have shown nothing new. After 40 years of surveys off the coast of Cape Cod, every square foot of that seabed had supposedly been mapped, logged, and cataloged. But on a gray morning in the shallow waters near Wellfleet, a technician aboard a marine survey vessel watched a shape appear on the display that shouldn't have been there. It was deep, deeper than any known debris field from the wreck they'd spent decades studying, and it was large. The boat's captain leaned over the screen, said nothing for a long moment, then picked up the radio and called it in. The wreck in question was the Whydah Gally, and if you know anything about pirate history, you know why that name matters. In April of 1717, the ship went down in a violent storm just off this same stretch of coast, taking with it nearly all of her crew and, according to legend, one of the largest pirate fortunes ever assembled. For over 2.5 centuries, the wreck sat lost, its exact location swallowed by shifting sand and cold Atlantic currents. When it was finally found in 1984, it became the first authenticated pirate shipwreck in American history. Coins, cannons, and personal effects by the thousands were pulled from the sea floor. It should have been the end of the mystery. It wasn't, because even after 40 years of excavation, divers and researchers kept running into the same uncomfortable pattern. Sections of the wreck that should have been fully cleared kept producing new material. Survey equipment kept picking up readings that contradicted earlier maps of the same exact coordinates. And now, this new anomaly, sitting far below the known debris field, was forcing a question nobody wanted to ask out loud. What if the Whydah wasn't one wreck, but several layers of disturbed seabed stacked on top of each other, shaped by forces that had nothing to do with the original 1717 disaster? To understand why that question mattered so much, you have to go back to the man who sank that ship in the first place. Samuel Bellamy was not the pirate of popular imagination. He didn't fly a skull and crossbones for the theater of it. And he didn't run his crew through fear alone. Bellamy captained one of the most disciplined, and by the standards of the time, unusually democratic pirate crews on record. Decisions on his ship were often put to a vote. Plunder was divided according to an agreed code, not handed out at the captain's whim. His crew included men from a dozen different backgrounds and nations. Many of them former sailors who had jumped from merchant ships and slavers to join him. Some of them men who had escaped slavery entirely and found, on a pirate deck, a version of freedom the colonies would never have offered them. The Whydah herself had begun her life as a slave ship, built in London and outfitted for the brutal Atlantic trade before Bellamy's crew captured her in the Caribbean. When they took her, they found her holds already loaded with valuable cargo, and over the following months, Bellamy's crew added to that haul by raiding dozens of other vessels along the shipping lanes. By early 1717, the Whydah was, by most contemporary estimates, carrying one of the richest pirate treasures ever assembled at sea. Then came the storm. On the night of April 26th, a violent nor'easter caught the Whydah as she sailed north along the Cape Cod coastline. Witnesses on shore later described conditions no ship should have survived, and the Whydah didn't survive them. She broke apart in the surf, and somewhere between 140 and 146 men died in the wreck. Only 2 men are confirmed to have survived. For local residents who woke the next morning to find wreckage and bodies scattered along the beach, and for the colonial authorities who arrived soon after to investigate, one question mattered more than any other. Where did the gold go? That question has never fully gone away, and as this new sonar anomaly was about to prove, the answer was going to be far stranger than anyone expected. The survey team didn't dive that day. Instead, they marked the coordinates, pulled their equipment, and brought the readings to the lab. What they found waiting for them there would only deepen the confusion. Weeks earlier, a routine excavation near the known debris field had turned up a small silver coin, corroded but legible enough to identify. Coins like this weren't unusual at the Whydah site. Thousands had already been cataloged since the wreck's discovery in 1984, but when this particular coin was sent for analysis, the mint date on it came back wrong. Not damaged, not ambiguous. Wrong, the coin had been struck years after the Whydah went down. For a moment, the archaeologists on the project assumed contamination, a coin dropped by a modern diver. Or debris shifted in from somewhere else entirely. But the coin wasn't found near the surface. It was recovered from within the same sediment layer as confirmed 1717 wreckage, sitting alongside iron fittings and ballast stone that had never been disturbed since the night of the storm. If the dating was accurate, and multiple labs confirmed that it was, then something impossible seemed to be true. Someone had added material to the wreck site after the disaster, and that material had settled into the seabed as though it had always belonged there. That single coin sent researchers back into the colonial archives, looking for anything that might explain how new material could have entered a supposedly undisturbed site. What they found was a document that had been sitting quietly in a Massachusetts historical archive for decades, largely overlooked because nobody had reason to look for it. It was a colonial authorization, dated only weeks after the Whydah sank, granting formal permission for a salvage operation along that stretch of coast. This wasn't unusual on its own. Colonial governments routinely authorized salvage after a major wreck, both to recover valuable cargo and to control what local residents were doing with washed-up goods. What was unusual was what came next, or rather, what didn't. There was no follow-up report, no inventory of recovered goods, no record of what, if anything, the salvage crew actually found. In an era when colonial administrators were meticulous about documenting recovered property, especially anything connected to piracy, the silence was glaring. A maritime historian working with the excavation team put it simply: either the salvage operation found nothing worth reporting, which seemed unlikely given eyewitness accounts of gold washing up on the beach for days after the wreck, or someone made sure that report never existed. That idea that a 300-year-old cover-up might explain a modern anomaly was enough to send the research team back into the water with a new question guiding their work. If early salvagers had recovered treasure and deliberately avoided documenting it, could their activity explain why the site had never behaved the way a single, undisturbed wreck should? The divers turned their attention to something that had puzzled them for years, but never seemed important enough to investigate closely: the sandbar system protecting the wreck. Conventional wisdom held that the shifting sand covering and uncovering sections of the Whydah moved randomly, driven by unpredictable tides and storms. But when a geologist reviewing decades of survey data plotted the sand movement against the calendar, a pattern emerged that nobody expected. The sand didn't move randomly at all. It shifted in a consistent seasonal rhythm, exposing certain sections of the wreck at roughly the same time each year and burying others just as predictably. For modern archaeologists working with sonar and satellite data, this was an interesting curiosity. But for an 18th century wrecker working with nothing but local knowledge passed down through generations of fishermen, a predictable pattern like that would have been priceless. It would have meant knowing exactly when the sea was going to hand back a piece of the Whydah, year after year, long before anyone with proper equipment ever arrived to look. Suddenly, the missing salvage report didn't look like an isolated mystery. It looked like the beginning of something that might have continued for generations, hidden in plain sight along a coastline that never stopped giving up its secrets on its own schedule. If local wreckers had been quietly working the site for generations, using nothing more than tidal knowledge passed down through families, then the entire foundation of the Whydah legend needed a second look. And that second look started with a question nobody had thought to ask before: how much treasure was actually on that ship the night it sank? For nearly 300 years, the accepted number had been treated almost like fact, repeated in books, documentaries, and museum placards. But numbers like that almost always trace back to a handful of original sources, and when a maritime historian working with the excavation team went looking for the earliest of those sources, she found something unsettling in the deposition of one of the only two confirmed survivors of the wreck. The testimony, given to colonial authorities within weeks of the disaster, described the ship's final days differently than expected. According to this account, the Whydah had made at least one unrecorded stop along the coast before the storm hit. A stop where cargo was reportedly moved off the ship. The document was vague about exactly what was unloaded and where it went, likely intentionally vague, since admitting to hiding pirate plunder was not something a man facing a colonial court wanted on the record. But the implication was clear enough. Some portion of the treasure everyone had spent 300 years searching for might never have been aboard the Whydah when she sank at all. That revelation alone would have been enough to reshape the entire investigation. But the survey team wasn't finished with the seabed yet, and their next find complicated things even further. While mapping debris patterns around the newly discovered deep anomaly, sonar operators picked up wreckage that didn't match any known component of the Whydah. Timber fragments, iron fittings, and ballast stone consistent with an entirely different vessel tangled directly into the same debris field. No official record of the 1717 disaster mentioned a second ship in that location. No survivor account, no colonial report, nothing in the archives suggested that Bellamy's ship had gone down anywhere near another vessel that night. For the team on site, this raised an uncomfortable possibility. Either an unrecorded ship had been present during the storm and never documented, or the wreckage had arrived at that location at a completely different time, meaning the debris field wasn't the result of one catastrophic night, but of multiple maritime disasters layered on top of each other across the centuries. Either explanation meant the site was far more complicated than the simple single wreck story that had defined it since 1984. Around the same time, a researcher working through colonial-era shipping and merchant records made a discovery that connected the missing salvage report to something concrete. Buried in a private merchant's ledger, dated only a few months after the wreck, was a line item recording the purchase of what the ledger vaguely called recovered cargo. Paid for in coin and goods that matched no legitimate shipment on record for that period. It wasn't proof, not in a courtroom sense. But it was the closest thing yet to physical evidence that someone had quietly moved Whydah treasure back into colonial trade networks almost immediately after the disaster, exactly as the missing salvage report had hinted. Then came the detail that made even the most skeptical archaeologists on the team stop and reconsider everything. While cataloging the position of recovered cannons across the site, a team mapping the debris field noticed the placement didn't match what you'd expect from a ship torn apart by a storm and left untouched for centuries. Cannons don't organize themselves. The pattern looked deliberate, as if something or someone had repositioned parts of the wreck long after the original disaster. The wreck of the Whydah was no longer just a pirate ship lost to a storm. It was starting to look like a crime scene that had been quietly disturbed again and again for 300 years. With the cannon pattern refusing to make sense, the team turned to the one person who had spent more time on that wreck than almost anyone alive, a veteran diver who had worked the site since the early years of excavation. He'd seen every section of that debris field up close, year after year, longer than most of the researchers now running the investigation had been alive. When the team asked him directly about one particular section near the deep sonar anomaly, something changed. He didn't answer right away. He looked away from the camera, paused, and simply said that section wasn't something he wanted to discuss on record. That silence turned out to mean something concrete. A records request into decades of excavation permits revealed that the exact section the diver avoided had been quietly excluded from public archaeological work for years, without any public explanation ever issued. For a site that had been studied, photographed, and documented almost obsessively since 1984, one section being deliberately left out of the record was impossible to ignore. The answer to why became clear once the investigation moved from the seabed to the courthouse. Legal filings going back decades exposed a long-running, largely unpublicized dispute over ownership rights to the wreck, involving multiple salvage companies who had each claimed some right to material recovered from the site over the years. Buried within those filings were references to artifacts that had been recovered, but never formally reported to the state, held privately while ownership questions remained unresolved. In other words, some of the treasure the public had spent decades believing was still lost, hidden somewhere under the sand, may have already been found. It simply never re-entered the public record. That discovery reframed almost everything the investigation had uncovered so far. The missing salvage report from 1717, the predictable sandbar exposing sections of wreck on a schedule only locals could have known, the ledger recording a mysterious cargo purchase, the oddly placed cannons, the diver's silence. Each one, on its own, had looked like an isolated anomaly. Together, they described a pattern that had repeated itself in different forms across 3 centuries, treasure disappearing not through any single dramatic theft, but through generations of quiet, small-scale removal, undocumented by design. But one mystery remained unresolved, the deep anomaly that had started the entire investigation. When the team finally cleared to dive on it, core samples confirmed something nobody had anticipated. Beneath the known Whydah debris sat an older layer of ballast stone and hardware, materials and construction methods consistent with a ship far older than 1717. Bellamy's crew, sailing into that fatal storm 3 centuries ago, hadn't simply sunk in open water. They had crashed almost directly on top of the wreckage of an earlier, undocumented disaster, one that predated the Whydah by an unknown number of years and had never been recorded in any surviving colonial account. That final piece changed the entire shape of the story. The Whydah's treasure was never sitting in one hidden hoard waiting to be found, guarded by a single secret or a single culprit. It had been slowly pulled apart by the sea itself, by storms that scattered it along the coast the very night it sank, by colonial wreckers who understood the sand better than anyone with modern equipment ever would, by merchants willing to quietly absorb stolen coin into legitimate trade, and by more recent legal disputes that buried recovered artifacts in private hands rather than public. Museums. The mystery was never really about finding gold. It was about how easily history can be rewritten, one undocumented transaction at a time, until the truth becomes almost impossible to separate from the legend. 300 years later, the search continues. Not because the treasure is hidden in some singular secret location, but because pieces of it are scattered across archives, private collections, and a seabed that keeps shifting on a schedule nobody controls. Some of it may never surface again. Some of it, quietly, already has. If stories like this, real mysteries, real history, and real investigations keep you hooked until the very end, make sure you subscribe for more. There are countless untold stories still waiting beneath the waves.